The fourth thing is attitude. It's your mindset. I always say to my colleagues, if you don't like something, change it. But if it's not in your power to change it, then you have to change your attitude to it. And you have to remember that to change something and change it for the better are two really different things. So I have one rule, one personal rule for myself that determines my attitude to the decisions that I'm making. Am I moving in this direction? Am I going to take this risk? I ask myself one thing. If I do this, what is the worst thing that can happen to me and to my business? And I think if you can protect your downside, if you can truly look the worst case scenario in the eye and be comfortable with it, it's a great measure of what your attitude is to what you do next.
The 5 dysfunctions are an absence of trust, which means there's no transparency. That's a problem. And so if you want a great culture, you're going to have trust and transparency. There's a lot of times the culture of an organization is undermined because there's a fear of conflict. In other words, nobody will say what needs to be said. There's a fear of calling it tight. And I'm going to remind you of something I said yesterday. Nothing can change until the unsaid is spoken. That's a fact. That is a fact. It ain't going to change unless somebody's got the courage to say it. Fear of conflict, a lack of commitment. So if you want to have an organization that's a high-performance team as opposed to a high-maintenance team, you got to have a bias for urgency, a bias for excellence. But a lot of times in organizations, there's a low bias for, there's no urgency. And they tolerate mediocrity instead of tolerating excellence. In a high-performance team, there's accountability and a culture. A culture in a high-performance team is people see it, own it, solve it, do it. See it, own it, solve it, do it. That's accountability. That's what we want. But in a low culture, it's going to be no ownership. And finally, in a high-performance culture, there's going to be measuring and attention to results. And in a low-performance culture, there's inattention to results. There's no measurement. There's no scorecards. There's no standards. The rule of thumb is do the best you can. Well, that's the problem. Problem is I got a bunch of people trying to do the best they can instead of delivering on the outcomes and the deliverables that we need in order to be successful. This is a cultural statement. What you're looking at up here would be a bad culture. The flip side of this would be a great culture. And you'll notice this has nothing to do with a nap room or the jelly beans in the kitchen.
The very highest value was, by the ancient Greeks, was called the telos. The telos means end in mind. It's an intrinsic value, not a derivative value or an extrinsic value, but an intrinsic value that's a calling that the theologians describe, that's an inspiration to do, that nobody has to remind you to do. Nobody has to remind me for 44 years to get up and research, write, travel, and teach. Nobody has to remind me to do what I love doing that is truly inspiring. And everyone in this room has something that they love doing that nothing has to be motivating them to do. They just do it. Accessing that is accessing a gold mine. As Warren Buffett says, that's where you tap dance to do your work. Accessing that intrinsic value where you have incredible vitality. The moment you live congruently and in tune with that highest value, the blood supply, glucose and oxygen in the brain, in the executive center, the forebrain, the telencephalon in the brain lights up on a functional MRIs, and glucose goes there, and there's activation in the most advanced part of the brain, the forebrain, and you activate inspired vision, strategic planning, literally strategic action, executing the actions, and self-governance. There's literally brain pathways from this medial prefrontal cortex down into the amygdala, and it calms down the amygdala, which is impulsive and instinctual, which is basically an animal response, to a human angelic response of inspired vision. When we live by our highest values, We electrify our vitality. We automatically magnetize with an enthusiasm and an inspiration people, places, things, ideas, and events into our life to create.
Of life is to be successful. One of the biggest challenges that I think we have in this country is we're not very good at accepting failure. And failure, to me, is very much part of the journey of success. If you cannot embrace failure, you don't learn, you don't grow. And I think if you go back to my journey, those 3 businesses that I invested in where I failed is probably where I learned the most. So I think, actually recognizing and understanding that success is not one journey. You will have ups and downs. The question is, how do you deal with the downs? Do you deal with them as well as you do with the highs? And that really separates, I think, the weak from the strong.
Some of the greatest ideas in the world today are right in your head right now. If we shut the doors in this room right now, and we stayed here for 3-4 hours, there is an idea in this room that would change the world, that would all make us a fortune. That's how close creativity is to us. We haven't got to go to university. We haven't got to be the smartest person. We haven't got to read books and go to museums. It's here. It's here right now. And mine one was sitting at a kitchen table with a few paintbrushes and a couple of bottles of oil and fragrance. And as I painted my body, and I was playing with fragrance, creating it, it was like, there it is, right before you, Joe. You go create paintbrushes and get the world to paint themselves with fragrance like artists. And that's exactly what I did.
It's like, it's interesting. I find it very easy to believe in other people, or in my children, or in my spouse, or my whatever. And yet with myself, I'm totally different. So, you might talk about being your own best friend. You might talk about being your own best coach. You might talk about being your own best cheerleader. I don't care what you use. But you have to find a way to really like your stuff. And the reason is you take it with you everywhere you go. You're not going to do anything or go anywhere in any competition in this thing called life where you don't bring yourself with you. And boy, if you don't like your stuff, it's going to show up. And that's why it's really about, as I said earlier, it's about, can you trust yourself enough to do it your way within a plan?